Hello, everyone. You're very welcome to this presentation of the results of the 7th quarterly survey undertaken by the Centre for Cross-Border Studies in relation to the conditions for North-South and East-West cooperation. And as usual, I am joined by Ben Rosher, who undertook the analysis of the responses to the survey and who will be taking us through the presentation of the kind of headlines around those results, giving you some of the core stats that we took from that survey and some of the core responses in terms of what people were saying about North, South and East, West cooperation. So just to begin, I'd just like to share the screen so that we can get started. So forgive me for a moment, just for a quick pause, and hopefully you'll be able to see that. So obviously, sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Anthony Soares. I'm the Director of the Centre for Cross-Border Studies, and Ben Rosher, very well known to you all by now, is a CCBS Research Associate and is also a PhD candidate at Queen's University, Belfast. So, as I said, you're very welcome to this presentation of the results of the 7th quarterly survey. As I usually say, but it's important to stress, this survey that we undertake, and we've been undertaking ever since the first quarter of 2021, it's a really important way of giving us an understanding of the extent to which those conditions for North-South and East-West cooperation are being maintained, and how relations between civic society organisations and local authorities in the island of Ireland are being safeguarded in terms of those North, South and East, West kind of relations, that those channels for cooperation following the end of that Brexit transition period and the implementation of the protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland, although bearing in mind that as it stands, the protocol is not being implemented in all of its parts, as there have been grace periods implemented around issues to do with the movement of goods between GB and NI. But anyway, this survey is really aimed at specifically civic society organisations and local authorities on the island of Ireland. And the reason that we did that, really, just to remind you, is that when the European Commission and the UK government undertook a mapping exercise of North-South cooperation in the negotiations leading up to the UK's withdrawal, they looked at all of the areas, the areas of cooperation, came up with about 142 different areas of North-South cooperation. But what they actually left out, and both the EU and the UK admitted to this, was that that North-South cooperation mapping exercise didn't really capture areas of informal, local and community level cooperation, which really are the blood of a lot of and the life of a lot of the North-South cooperation, as well as East-West cooperation. So we felt it was really important to make sure that we did capture what was going on at those kind of more local, community-led levels of cooperation. And as I usually say, we are really grateful to all of those who responded regularly to our surveys. We're so grateful to you all, and we do really need your ongoing help in responding to the future surveys, so that we can continue to raise issues that are important to you, that you are kind of encountering in terms of your ability to undertake North-South and or East-West cooperation. And this really is a reminder that in terms of Brexit, in terms of the protocol, this really is a marathon. It's not a sprint. It's not something that's going to be over and done with and everything is going to be tidied up within the next week or the next month or even the next year. This is an ongoing process. Therefore, we really do need to keep this monitoring of North, South and East, West cooperation going, and therefore we also need your ongoing help in that particular activity. And also to remind you that these responses and these surveys, that they're not just, let's say, academic exercises. They're not just reports that sit on a shelf. The responses are actually used. We use them in the Centre for Cross-Border Studies, and we also use them in terms of our work with other organisations particularly those who are involved in the work of the ad hoc group for North, South and East West cooperation, which we, the Centre for Cross-Border Studies, convene. And that group does meet on a regular basis with relevant decision makers and relevant policy makers who have responsibility, either directly or indirectly, for the implementation of the protocol, and also responsibility for maintaining North, South and East West cooperation. So all of those issues that are raised, we do then bring them directly to the attention of those decision and policy makers in order to make sure that we do safeguard the conditions for North, South and East West cooperation. I'm going to hand over shortly to Ben, who's going to take us through the results for the 7th quarterly survey. But just briefly to recap, in terms of this particular survey, the 7th quarterly survey, it captured the period between July and the end of September, the period where we continued to operate in the absence of a functioning Northern Ireland executive or the absence of a Northern Ireland Assembly, but it's also a period where we saw a high level of political turmoil in London. We saw a new Prime Minister being put in place shortly after, to be replaced by our most recent Prime Minister. So a lot of political turmoil in London, a lot of uncertainty in terms of who to engage with when you're talking about engaging with Northern Ireland in terms of an executive or with a UK government. It's also a period that actually began probably late February to early March, where there was little to no engagement between the UK and the EU, and no real activity going on there. Although when our previous Prime Minister into the UK, Liz Truss, became Prime Minister, there seemed to be a change of mood in terms of how the UK was approaching its engagement with the EU, and we seem to see some kind of re-engagement on that front, and that seems to be continuing now with the new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. And I think as Ben goes through the presentation, some of that turmoil, some of that let's say political vacuum on certain fronts might have come through in terms of the responses to the survey. But I'm going to hand over now to Ben. So Ben, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Anthony, and hello, everybody. Yeah, as Anthony says, normally in this survey, we tend to get a lot of respondents point towards the lack of Stormont and lack of an executive. This quarter, there has been, or this has been exacerbated, or there's been an interaction effect with the lack of consistency at Westminster, and so there's the uncertainty has multiplied considerably over this last quarter, which I'll speak more in detail on in a second. So welcome to those of you who've joined us before, and welcome to everybody for the first time. I'm going to give a general overview of the results of the 7th quarterly survey, and a fuller analysis is going to be made available in the research briefing, which will be launched, I think I'm ready to send this afternoon or tomorrow. I'm just going to, in this session, I'll give an explanation of the data, how we can use it, and any caveats and limitations we need to bear in this analysis and for any subsequent analysis. I'll then give a breakdown on the respondents to this survey before heading into the substantive parts of the analysis, which speak to the experiences and perceptions of cross-border contact, cooperation and collaboration, both North, South and East, West, and attitudes towards the protocol, again, North, South and East, West. Now, for this round of the survey, 96% of respondents have completed at least one previous round of the survey. And that the survey has been, as Anthony said, repeated every quarter since the start of 2021. And given that now we have a consistently high number of repeat respondents, always within the 90s, we're in a good position to infer the shape of some trends regarding views and experiences of the protocol in a practical sense with a good degree of clarity. The insights we get from the quantitative dimensions of the survey are further developed and complemented through the inclusion of qualitative responses to the central contextual questions, And this allows for some more nuanced and granular insights into how respondents are experiencing the changing political, social, regulatory, and material conditions for North-South and East-West collaboration. And this quarter, we've also asked people for concrete suggestions on ways to improve these different environments and these different contexts. As we have been for this year, we're asking respondents whether, in their opinion, the protocol is a good or a bad thing for North-South and East-West cooperation. And taken together, the quantitative and qualitative dimensions prove invaluable in painting a more detailed picture of the current context for cross-border collaboration across these islands. As always, we need to recognise that the respondents to all rounds of the survey have a wealth of insight and experience and expertise. And so given the nature of the contributions, we need to read them with this light that these are sort of expert practitioners, as you will, in the field, and so have a great deal of depth and insight into these issues. Excuse me. Now, the data for this survey has been collected by a survey of self-selected respondents between the 1st and 30th of September 2022. We've got 45 responses in total. 43 of those report that they completed the survey in the previous quarter or in a previous quarter, while 2% are new respondents. Of the 45 responses to the survey, 36% were based in the Republic of Ireland, 49% based in Northern Ireland, and 16% have a presence on both sides of the border. So this quarter, a slight overrepresentation of Northern Ireland compared to the Republic of Ireland. If we look towards the North-South contact and collaboration, in this quarter, 90% of respondents report having meetings with an organisation in the other jurisdiction on the island of Ireland. For 49% of respondents, their level of contact this quarter has been at the same level as the last quarter and has increased for 31% of respondents. Now, 68% of respondents reported that meetings with organisations in the other jurisdiction discuss challenges to cross-border cooperation, either on occasion for 43% or to a significant extent for a quarter of respondents. It is worth noting on this that this is a fall from a combined 82% in the previous quarter. And the nature of these challenges are focused heavily on a lack of accessibility to funding or a lack of knowledge of accessibility to funding, as well as concerns around the impending introduction of the electronic travel authorization scheme for cross-border travel for non-visa nationals. So that's primarily going to impact non-Irish EU nationals, and that is due to be rolled out from the start of 2023. However, we're still quite light on information as to how this is going to work in practice. Now, 87% of respondents are currently involved in cross-border collaboration with a partner in the other jurisdiction. And the main areas of collaboration presently focus on the environment, on cross-border cooperation, on community development, and 70% of respondents are actively considering new collaborative projects. So again, this dimension has always been rather robust since we've started the survey, in that a majority of respondents are still engaging with people north to south and are constantly on the lookout for new opportunities for engagement. So that this is continuing is encouraging. We also have 62% of respondents who are presently engaged in cross-border collaboration have reported that they are in receipt of funding for these collaborative projects specifically, with the predominant source of funding being from the Irish government. If we look now towards the perceptions of the contextual environments for cooperation and collaboration, in terms of the political context, 53% of respondents believe that the political context has stayed more or less the same on the previous quarter, with a third saying it's deteriorated. When we've asked people to expand on these experiences, respondents have primarily pointed to issues arising from, as we've said earlier, absence of a functioning assembly in Northern Ireland and the uncertainty and disruption in Westminster politics. And we can see in the quotes here from the respondents. Given the elections in Northern Ireland and no assembly formed, it's difficult to engage. Also, with PM election in the UK and now change of cabinet, little engagement seems to have been able to take place. Again, for much of this period, political uncertainty in London has not allowed for the improvement of the context for cooperation, although more positive signs began to emerge more recently. However, it is too soon to tell whether this positivity will endure. So basically what we are seeing is a manifestation of uncertainty and inconsistency among high-level political environments mean that nobody at local levels are really able to plan with any sense of certainty about what the future is likely to look like. If we look towards the social context now, 18% of respondents say that it is deteriorated on the previous quarter, and only 9% say it's improved. But the predominant response again is that it has remained the same on the last quarter, with 64% of respondents reporting that it's remained the same. And when we've asked people to elaborate on this, responses have focused quite heavily on the cost of living crisis as having an impact, some not necessarily negative, but primarily negative. And also the implications of the political stasis, again, Northern Ireland and Westminster, having an impact on the social dimension. So we look to the quotes here, we've got a lack of local government and increased social priorities around income crisis driven by Westminster is having an impact on the ground. The social context has always been supportive of collaboration, but the uncertainty regarding the political context impacts on social and civil society organisations in terms of cross-border and all-Ireland collaboration. And the cost of living crisis potentially limiting the capacity to become involved in wider collaboration, though could also be a spur for some. And I would read into that it's maybe that because people are struggling with cost of living, it's driving sort of community sentiment where people are looking out for their neighbours more, perhaps, but that needs to be investigated a little more. In terms of the regulatory context, 60% of respondents say that the regulatory context has remained the same on the last quarter. So again, majority think that it's stayed pretty much stable, and 20% say that it's deteriorated. What's a particular concern here is that no respondent has reported an improvement in the North-South regulatory context. And this is the same as the previous two quarters. We've got 6 months now where no respondent has reported there's been an improvement here. And this is something that needs to be monitored and addressed. And when we've asked respondents to develop on their experiences, they've primarily reported to, as is consistent, again, uncertainty around the protocol, and as again is a common theme with this, outworkings of the current political impasse in Westminster in Stormont. So we've got the quotes here, nothing is really changing in regulation or legislation because we still have no functioning regional government and UK are not significantly moving to regulate for the North. At the end of October, we will know what comes next. Arguably at the end of October, we're still not in a particularly certain state, given we've got another change of personnel and likely a new assembly election to be called, but hopefully we will get some certainty at some point around those. Continued uncertainty around the Northern Ireland Protocol and no prospect of negotiated solution. And I put that there twice, so I'm just going to get rid of that one. With regard to the material context for North-South collaboration, 62% of respondents believe it is the same as the previous quarter, and 20% report that it's deteriorated, and 13% say they don't know. When we've asked people to elaborate here, people have pointed primarily towards increased costs, both in terms of monetary increased costs and in terms of increased costs due to friction, which increases time or increases time costs. So we've got what would have taken 10 days, now takes 10 weeks. There is still the uncertainty of what impact any changes to the Northern Ireland Protocol have on goods and services will have, and is that a standstill given the elections both in Northern Ireland and in the UK, and the new cabinet in the UK is formed, is difficult to say. And the impact of the currency crisis in sterling and rising energy and inflation costs is having a negative impact on many organisations, particularly those in civil society. As I say, it's the first time we've asked this question within the survey, but we've asked people for some concrete suggestions for how to improve these conditions in these environments. And broadly in the North-South dimension, suggestions focused on improvements to infrastructure, to travel, to healthcare and to communications. So one here is the emphasis on positive benefits of collaboration on issues like energy, sustainability, transport, and even healthcare. These are areas where there has been regular ongoing collaboration, but the likes of people traveling for operations in either jurisdiction often goes under the radar. Clarity regarding funding, particularly ESF funding and others, and clarity regarding the political context is crucial to support cooperation amongst the civil society and research organisations on those issues impacting on people and households across the island, and also on preparatory work for the social, sectoral and economic changes to come to meet climate targets. And finally, the protocol might be amended to include freedom of movement for people in the north and south who are lawfully resident in either jurisdiction, as well as for goods. I think in here we're primarily seeing there needs to be improvement around communications, so that people know the opportunities that are available in the initiatives that are already ongoing, so that those can be developed. In terms of the protocol being amended to include free movement of people, the political reality of that, I would suggest, given that the government have rejected amendments that would see precisely this in terms of electronic travel authorization, that is going to be something that should be pressed, but it's going to be politically more difficult to be achieved. If we look to the East-West dimension now, this quarter, 58% of respondents report having meetings with organisations in Great Britain, and for 64% of respondents, this is the same level of contact as the previous quarter, and for 18% reported that their level of contact has increased. So again, we're seeing good, robust contact, both north-south and east-west, with the majority of respondents having some contact in collaboration with people either in Great Britain or north and south. 58% of respondents have reported that meetings with partners in Great Britain have discussed challenges to cooperation and collaboration, either on occasion for 39% or to a significant for 19%. And these challenges were, again, in terms of funding, has become a prominent issue this quarter. So these challenges were predominantly focused on issues with regards to accessing funding through Horizon and Peace 4. 60% of respondents say that they are currently involved in collaboration with a Great Britain-based organisation, and the predominant areas of collaboration east-west are on education, human rights, community development, and arts and culture. And 44% of respondents report that they are actively considering new collaborative projects with organisations in Great Britain. So while it's not quite as robust as North and South, we are, I'd say, seeing over previous quarters a slight development and certainly stability in cooperation and collaboration east-west. We'd like to see it increase, but it doesn't seem to be being damaged in the way that it was in the early days of these surveys, when we were looking at the beginning of 2021 and everything was being quite negatively impacted. We're starting to see some signs of recovery in these collaborations. 48% of respondents currently engaged in East-West collaborative projects have reported that their organisation was in receipt of funding for those projects. And these have mainly been drawn from the EU or from charitable foundations. And the lack of funding specifically from the UK government for these is something that has been quite notable throughout these surveys. And again, is something that maybe needs to be pressed to ensure that UK government has buy-in to these corporations and these collaborative projects from the highest level to make sure that they are maintained and developed. If we turn now to the perceptions of the contextual environments for cooperation and collaboration East-West, in terms of the political context, 51% of respondents believe that it is remained the same on the previous quarter, with 42% saying it's deteriorated. So it's been a pretty bad quarter in terms of the East-West political context. And again, when we've asked people to elaborate on this, it's political instability and uncertainty, both in Stormont and at Westminster, has been having a profoundly negative impact. And from the quotes here, we can see there's a lack of political leadership over the protocol, conservative leadership campaign, and a lame duck prime minister. With the election of a new PM taking place for part of this quarter and a new cabinet now in place, little decisions could be made by organisations in Great Britain. And uncertainty regarding fiscal policies, impact on trading, and the uncertainty regarding the EU and the Northern Ireland Protocol means a challenging political context. So what we're really seeing is a need for stability, certainly stability at Westminster given recent turmoil, and still a return for Stormont so that Northern Ireland can go ahead with some degree of leadership and certainty about the environment within which it's going to be operating. Looking to the social context, 62% of respondents have reported that it's remained the same on the previous quarter. 16% say it's deteriorated, and only 9% say it's improved. And respondents have said that the people working within rights and social justice work are working more closely together because the political context is more negative. So because of the lack of political leadership, people are having to form their own coalitions in their own groups in order to make things happen. The hostile environment is a political reality propelling social actors to more collaborative work. And also that there is narrow eligibility criteria for funding that is available for collaboration. So again, lack of access to or lack of knowledge to access to funding is something that is profoundly inhibiting North-South and East-West cooperation and collaboration. And just returning to my earlier point that all of the people responding to these surveys are experts in this field. This is what they do on a day-to-day basis. If these people are having trouble finding and identifying funding sources, then this speaks to a very profound problem in terms of either funding not being available or in terms of a communication issue that needs to be resolved in order to release funding to where it needs to be. In terms of the regulatory context, 22% of respondents say that it has deteriorated over the last quarter, with 53% saying it's remained the same on the previous quarter. And as we saw in terms of North-South, no respondent has reported an improvement in the regulatory environment. And so this is something to concern both North-South and East-West, in that respondents are saying there is no sign of improvement in the regulatory environment, and this is something that will need to be addressed. And this is clearly quite a lot to do with political turnover. It's a lot to do with the fact that there hasn't been much engagement between the UK and the EU since February, and that the protocol still remains a bone of contention. But this is something that cannot be allowed to sustain. Respondents have said that the regulatory environment is primarily defined by its uncertainty, which means that respondents are not sure where we stand on regulations at the moment, which does not allow for future planning. Look into the material context. 62% of respondents have reported that it's remained the same on the last quarter. 24% of respondents say that it has deteriorated, and 13% say that they don't know if or how the situation has changed. Generally, in terms of the material context, people have been citing inflation, so again, cost of living crisis, and regulatory uncertainty as having negative impacts in this environment. And the impact of fiscal policies on rising inflation and rising energy prices will have a negative impact on the material costs for collaboration, and simple issues of reliability on deliveries reduced due to customs and regulatory confusion. When we've asked for some suggestions on how to improve these various environments, one person said that we should widen the eligibility criteria for funding for collaboration and also make non-profit organisations aware of the funding opportunities available. I think there needs to be a think tank or forum to challenge Peace Corps on the lack of commitment or understanding of the importance of East-West relationship building. And this is certainly something that should be picked up, and to tone down the rhetoric on media. Now, moving towards the protocol, as it's now been in effect to some extent for well over a year, we are asking respondents whether they believe it is on balance broadly a good or bad thing for North-South and East-West cooperation. This quarter, 64% of respondents have reported that they believe it is on balance a good thing for North-South cooperation, compared to 29% who are unsure and only 7% who believe it's a bad thing. In terms of East-West relations, 44% say that the protocol is on balance a good thing for East-West cooperation, with 40% unsure and 16% reporting it as a bad thing. Comparing these to the last quarter, there is a decrease in outright support for the protocol, both North-South and East-West, but this change is not resulting in respondents being negative or hostile towards the protocol, but rather expressing uncertainty as to whether it's a good or bad for both North-South and East-West cooperation. Again, this might stem from the broader political uncertainty in that nobody's entirely sure in what state the protocol will ultimately be settled, because, as Anthony has said, it is not fully implemented as designed, and we have various unilateral extensions in grace periods that are underpinning it right now. But until these are agreed and codified, nobody can say with any certainty how long they will continue for. Now, in addition to the open text questions we've asked specifically around political, social, regulatory and material conditions and the suggestions for improvement on these dimensions, we've also asked respondents to provide, in their own words, any additional comments and insights they feel would be beneficial to helping us and policymakers in understanding the impact of Brexit and the protocol on cross-border cooperation and contact. We've got relationships on the island are in perpetual motion, similar to other parts of the world. Politics is changing quickly, and we now see how international events in Ukraine have an impact even on this island. The work of conflict resolution must be continuous and improved to react to the changing context all the time. Insufficient level of attention has been given to the NI situation in recent years, which means that there may be slippage in the confidence building measures to ensure peace and non-violence. The protocol, although flawed, is necessary due to the decision to leave the EU. The protocol is positive for North-South cooperation, as it allows enterprise in the North to access EU markets and should promote economic growth in the region. In terms of East-West dimension, the protocol is the agreed mechanism to manage the relationship between the UK and the EU, and has been ratified by the UK Parliament. To this end, it can be positive to manage and support that very damaged working relationship. Now, just to wrap up the analysis for this quarterly survey, the central theme that emerged from this quarterly survey are concerns around political instability, both in Northern Ireland, as the executive remains absent, and in Westminster as a result of the turmoil that has underpinned Westminster and Number 10 for the last 5 months, really. This is manifesting into prolonged uncertainty for cross-border organisations who fear that new administrations may make changes to a protocol with which they've only recently got to grips. And this has a particularly detrimental impact on the regulatory environment, both North-South and East-West. So no respondents reported an improvement in the last quarter and for 6 months in the North-South dimension. And respondents have been very emphatic in highlighting challenges that have arisen in accessing funding, both North-South and East-West. And there is clearly a need for improved communication and training for how to access and apply for funding. And this is an issue which all authorities must take responsibility for, both in Northern Ireland, and in Great Britain, to ensure that cooperation and coordination and collaboration across these islands can be maintained and developed. Now, I am going to finish up there. I hope this has been useful, and I'll pass back to Anthony.
Thanks very much, Ben. Excellent presentation. Really taken us through the kind of the highlights of the responses to that 7th quarterly survey. And as Ben mentioned at the start, there is a much more detailed report that goes with this presentation, and that will be available on the Centre for Cross-Border Studies website for those of you who are watching. As this presentation is made on the day, so it's 1st of November, the research report will be made available today on the centre's website. So you please do have a look at it. It gives you a much more detailed analysis of the responses to that 7th quarterly survey. And just to wrap up, just to highlight some of the things that Ben took us through in terms of the responses to that survey. One of the issues is a continuing issue. It's been there really since the very start of these quarterly surveys, and that is the lack of funding, or if not the lack of funding, although I think that is actually what it is, or it's a lack of clarity in terms of the availability of funding for East-West cooperation. There is a clear, you can see it coming through in the responses in terms of the percentage of those who are in receipt of funding for the East-West cooperation, and indeed for those who do have any funding for that East-West cooperation, where it's actually coming from. So very few instances, if any, in terms of those who are in receipt of funding for the East-West cooperation from the UK government. And from the Centre for Cross-Border Studies point of view, that was a concern that we raised in terms of the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, which does not appear to really support cross-border cooperation. It really is for funding specifically aimed for activities within particular regions of the UK rather than between regions of the UK, and indeed between regions of the UK and, let's say, the Republic of Ireland. And just on that, again, that East-West dimension, one of the consequences of the UK's departure from the EU is, in terms of an East-West connection, is the failure now to replace the Interreg program that existed between Wales and Ireland. That has disappeared, so that connection has been lost, and that particular source of financial support for those involved in collaboration between Wales and Ireland has disappeared. And our Peace Plus program, the eligible area is Northern Ireland and the 6 border counties of Ireland, although we should emphasise that from what we have learnt, that you can involve partners from outside of the eligible area into a project under Peace Plus. So that would give you the possibility of kind of bringing in partners from Great Britain or elsewhere. Although, of course, previously, in terms of the Interreg program that we had, that Interreg program, the eligible area was Western Scotland, Northern Ireland, and the 6 border counties of London. So, you know, that particular channel, that east-west channel, has also disappeared in the way that it had existed previously under Interreg. So that is an issue that has come up repeatedly. And I think it is something that merits more attention and action on behalf of the decision makers and policy makers in order to address that particular gap. The other thing that I noticed is in terms of the comparison between where respondents were indicating the political context for both North-South and East-West cooperation. The majority in both cases, the majority responses were that the political context had stayed the same, although to different extents. So we saw there, I think it was around, and Ben, you can nod, I think it was around the low 50s in terms of staying the same for the North-South cooperation bit for the political context, and a third, 33.3%, saying it had deteriorated.
Yeah.
So just to remind us that this is people indicating, comparing the political context for this quarter as in the third quarter in comparison to the previous quarter. And if we go back to the previous quarter, that was one where we saw an actual marked decline in terms of people's responses, where they had said that the majority response was that the political context had deteriorated. So it's staying the same, but it's staying the same as in compared to the quarter where it had deteriorated. And there's also a difference now in this quarter between there's 33.3% who say that the political context has deteriorated in relation to North-South cooperation, but it's over 40% for the West.
41% East-West. Again, it's 53% stay the same. So as I say, same on the previous one. It's people either think it's the same as the previous one, which was still declined, or it's getting worse. We're seeing in 2021, we were seeing a very steep downward trajectory, which did level out towards the start of 2022. And again, we seem to be heading gradually downwards again based on that, given the uncertainty. People just don't know where they stand. And so it's the lack of certainty and the lack of trust in politics means that there's just a gradual decline in that environment, in that context.
Yeah, and the other, just final thing, where people are, the respondents were looking at, so the regulatory context and the material context. So one of the things that you I won't say stress, pointed out, nobody is saying that the regulatory context for either North-South or East-West cooperation has improved, and I think this is the same for the material context. So there's no indication that people are saying things are getting easier, or maybe a better way to put it is clearer. And I think that's the big thing.
Yeah,
lack of clarity.
I think in terms of material context, some of it can be attributed to increased price, increased cost of living, having an impact. In terms of regulatory context, it's all coming down to the lack of communication between UK and EU, and lack of executive in Northern Ireland, and just a lack of structures that allow for any kind of improvement in a context that is barely sustainable.
Yeah, and again, I was going to pick up on that, but I'm glad you just did. In terms of where it's the material context, it's trying to work out, or perhaps it's impossible to work out, where it's to do with kind of global inflationary pressures. It's the war in Ukraine and how that is impacting on energy prices, and rather than necessarily strictly linked to the protocol itself, it's just, this things are more expensive. So yeah, we have to take that into account as well. But in terms of that issue around uncertainty around the regulatory context, I think perhaps one of the things that's kind of impacting in terms of uncertainty is we do now have the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill going through Westminster, where which potentially it's a unilateral kind of disapplication of the main parts of the protocol, so people kind of not sure where that's going on and how that's going to play out in terms of, if it does go through, what the reaction is going to be from the EU if it
Yeah. And with the Northern Ireland Assembly, if we call new elections, depend on what the arithmetic works out there. If the DUP come back with increased vote share and take the First Minister post back again, do they continue with their mandate against the protocol? If they come back with a lower vote share and Sinn Féin improve their position, what happens in that respect in terms of how Westminster progress with the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill?
Look, thank you so much, Ben, for taking us through that presentation. And as both Ben and myself said earlier, the research briefing, which gives you a lot more detail in terms of the responses to this 7th quarterly survey, will be available on our website. So please do go and have a look at that. But thank you, Ben, for taking the time to be with us, and thank you to all of you who have tuned in, have downloaded this, and are watching us now. So thank you, and I hope to see you again at a future time. Thank you.